In this film, we're going to look at the question of appropriability. In other words, how do we make sure we get the benefits and hold on to them from our great idea? Now, you could say, of course, why do we need to worry? Here we are. I've got some good ideas. Help yourself. Probably not so smart. For several reasons. One of them is that if you put in all that hard work to create and launch and take your innovation to scale, you probably want to get something back from it. Even if you don't want to make a fortune, even if you want to change the world, social innovation, you probably still need something coming back, some return from your investment in order to fund the great social change you want. So we need to think about this question of appropriability. How far and how can we hang on to the gains from our value-adding innovation? Now, there may be situations where we actually want to give it away, but that's a strategic decision. If you think about Tesla, one of the approaches they're taking with their cars is to open up a great deal of what they do to others, because what they want to do is to create a new kind of industry, to reinvent the automobile world. A long time back, when Philips invented the compact cassette, we don't use cassettes very much these days, but the compact cassette was a great innovation in recording technology. But what they didn't do was then hold on to the technology so that it was only Philips or people they licensed it to. They wanted to promote this approach, and so they released it without a patent, without any protection, in order to encourage diffusion. So appropriability is something that we can make choices about, but one thing is clear. We need to have a strategy for thinking about appropriability. So, if appropriability is important, how do we do it? How do we ensure that we can protect and hold on to the gains and not have others compete or steal our ideas? Well, there's a number of approaches, but we can think mostly in terms of what is sometimes called the appropriability regime. Now, that's a long word, but what it really means is the extent to which we have a strong or a weak way of protecting our ideas so that others can't copy them. Think of it a bit like a castle. How well built is it in terms of protecting what's at the heart? If it's got thick walls and a moat and a drawbridge, that's a strong appropriability regime. If it's a little bit like the little pigs in the fairy story and it's just built of sticks, one blow and it all collapses. That's a weak appropriability regime. So how can we construct an appropriability regime, a way of protecting our ideas so that we can receive the value from them? So how do we construct our appropriability regime? How do we build a strong castle? Well, the answer comes down to knowledge. After all, that's what innovation is, value from ideas. The ideas are our knowledge and we're wanting to create value from it. So can we make sure that knowledge is something we own and control? And how well can we defend that? And the term for this is our intellectual property, our IP. We can imagine a spectrum of opportunities to protect the knowledge in a number of different ways. But one of the things we have to think about today in a world of open innovation is that we don't necessarily just want to hold on to knowledge. We might want to trade it. We might want to exchange it or give things away. We want to have knowledge flowing rather than just something that we own. Now, this is interesting. The idea of open innovation is relatively new. It was originally developed around the early part of the 21st century. But actually, 100 years before that, pretty much, we saw the idea of this kind of open innovation, knowledge trading, played out. 3M is a company we've seen already. And 3M has been around just over 100 years. It was founded in 1902. And what the 3M company learned about very early on was the importance of working with different kinds of knowledge and beginning to trade it. One of their great successes, in fact their very first success, which you can still buy today, is some sandpaper called wet or dry. And the name says it all. It's a sandpaper that you can use wet as well as dry. And when you use it wet, of course, you don't have all that trouble with dust and so on that comes as a result of sanding. So it was an interesting idea, and way back in the 1920s, it was an idea desperately waiting to happen. Industry, businesses like the furniture industry or the car industry, were plagued by dust. But in the sandpaper days then, if you wet the sandpaper, it didn't work. It clogged up. So there was space for someone to come up with a sandpaper that would work wet or dry. And that person was a man called Francis Oakey. 3M didn't know Francis Oakey, but they came across him because he kept ordering samples of their sandpaper to test things with. They were curious, they went to visit him, and what they found was an entrepreneur, an innovator about to go bankrupt. He'd got a great idea for wet or dry sandpaper. He'd got a patent. He'd registered his intellectual property with the government, which gave him a kind of protection. But he had no money left. He had no distribution channels. He couldn't scale his innovation. What 3M did was to say, well, can we come on board? Would you like to work with us? Can we buy your patent and give you a role? And the result benefited everyone. Francis Oakey was able to carry on inventing many other products, and 3M launched in 1921 wet or dry sandpaper, which has sold billions of sheets over its years and is still in the shops today. So the idea of trading knowledge, the idea of managing intellectual property isn't just a passive one of holding it all to yourself. It's about strategically working with that knowledge to create value. So if we're going to protect our knowledge, protect our intellectual property, how can we do it? Well, there are a number of ways. In the example of Francis Oakey, the world of open innovation is one which says not all the smart people work for us. So can we find them, and can we find ways of working with their knowledge to help us? Or conversely, do we know something someone else wants to benefit from? But in order to indulge in this kind of knowledge trading activity, we need to have a strategic approach to what we know. So how many different ways might there be for us to protect and conserve our intellectual property? Well, we can think of a spectrum, a number of possibilities. At one end, we have what's called tacit knowledge. We know it, but we haven't necessarily ever written it down. It's just something we know how to do. It's in our fingertips. Now that, of course, is quite protected knowledge because it's inside our heads and nobody else can get inside our heads. And tacit knowledge sometimes can provide a great deal of protection. We can begin to move across and say, well, actually, we do know how to explain it and write it down, and eventually other people will find out. But if we use it quickly, if we move first, if we're the first mover, then we can build our name associated with that before the others catch up. Further along the spectrum, we can have more formal protection. We can write it down and register a patent or a copyright. These are well-established legal instruments which have been around for hundreds of years, which give people who create knowledge some protection. If you want to use my idea and I have a patent on it, you have to pay me a license fee in order to use it. Further along the spectrum, we get to other interesting models where we're starting to move into this world of open innovation, we're starting to trade things. And as we move along our spectrum, so we have different possibilities. For example, we might have something which is made explicit, it's codified, it's perhaps more open. Our protection is it's hard to do. The idea of lean thinking we've come across several times. And lean thinking is a way of thinking about any process. It began life in manufacturing, but it applies just as much in services and in the public sector. The thinking behind that, the original innovation, really began in Japanese companies in the post-war period. And companies like Toyota learned the hard way how to develop a completely new approach to manufacturing which reduced waste of every kind. That's fine, but it's not really something you can put a patent on to protect it. But Toyota realized it had taken them 20 years to learn that. Anybody else wanting to do lean, even though the principles were widely available, would also have to go up a learning curve. And so sometimes just having something which you've learned how to do, you've invested in the learning, is a kind of protection. Not forever, but it gives you a head start. Further along our spectrum, we might have the situation where we may have some knowledge, but in order to make our knowledge work, to create value, we need those complementary assets that we saw in an earlier film. In other words, it's the what else and the who else and our ability to put those together which creates the value. So we have this spectrum from core knowledge, which is tacit, which is internal and tightly held, right the way through to knowledge which is more open and tradable. And so part of our strategy in thinking about appropriability is to work out which bits do we want to keep close and protect with patents and other forms, which bits are we prepared to trade, and which bits are going to be in the big wide open world, and to work with that. So let's summarize where we've been in this short film. We're concerned with this question of appropriability, that question of how to get the benefits and avoid somebody else copying or imitating our hard work away. Even if we want to give it away, even if we want to use it to change the world with a free idea, that kind of social innovation still has to cover its costs. It still has to pay its way. So we need to think about how to appropriate the gains from all the hard work we've done, which raises the question of the appropriability regime, the kind of castle we build to protect our knowledge, our innovation, and is that a strong or a weak castle? At the heart of this is the idea of knowledge. How do we strategically protect and then deploy and use our intellectual property? Now, let's pause for a moment and think about all of that.